Okay, Sheila, would you like to go ahead?
Welcome to the second welcome to the second No Cold War Britain event, Stop Asian Hate. I'm co-chairing the event with Susie. My name is Sheila from Pagoda Art, an art organization sharing Chinese culture and support the community in Liverpool for the last 40 years. From traditional Chinese music and dance to social welfare for Chinese-speaking people with language barriers. Throughout the lockdown, one of our projects with Writing on the Wall, a Liverpool-based creative writing organization, was in exploration of the impact COVID-19 has had on the lives of young people. They are aged 10 to 14. Here are two pieces of writing I felt I have to share with you from the young people. I wish I could tell my mom she doesn't understand the racist bully I go through. I wish she gave me an English name. I'm not someone that is going to eat your dog. I'm not someone who has the answers to every single question. I'm not always well behaved. I don't have smaller eyes than you. Mine are perfectly fine. I don't only have Chinese friends, I have others too. I don't know which Chinese person you're talking about. I don't know how to write your name. Isn't it just the same? We will not give you coronavirus because we coughed, and we will not get bullied by you. Last year, we were approached by many Chinese people reporting hate speeches directly towards them, and a worrying rise in hate-related physical attacks throughout Liverpool and other cities. This including young people from our orchestra as young as 5 years old. I was looking for support from other organizations. No Cold War Britain was one of the organizations that came to my attention. I was very impressed with the launch of the No Cold War International last year and the launch of the Britain in this year in June. And I very appreciate the efforts they put into exposing fake news and war-mongering behavior, as well as calling for peace at a time when many seems to turning a blind eye towards the Chinese community. Tonight, we have 10 exciting speakers standing up and speak out against Asian hate. Can we please welcome to our first speaker, Murad, Qureshi, the former Stop War chair and London Assembly member. He's the chair of the London Assembly Environment Committee and a member of the Transport Committee. He contributes regularly columns to the China Daily, Tribune, and West End Extra. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Murad.
Thank you very much for inviting me along this evening. It's, I think it's very, very important that we get together on this issue before it goes any further, because it's quite clear to me sitting here in London that the problem has heightened certainly during the whole COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, I'm reporting to you that race hate crime soared in London during the COVID pandemic. Between April 2020 and March 2021 this year, we had over 20,000 incidences. Previous year, there was about 17,000, and that's a 15% increase. But for those from the East and Southeast Asian backgrounds, the increase was some 179%. There are examples that I can quote. I'll give you one. The Singaporean law student, Jonathan Mock, who was attacked along Oxford Street, the premier high street in London, by a racist teenager who told him, "I don't want your coronavirus in my country." The boy and his friends kicked and punched the 23-year-old as he laid on the ground. It's also affected South Korean students. Son Soo Kim, who suffered racial slurs when customers asked if she had the right to work in the UK. So it's operating at different levels, and we shouldn't forget this at all. And during COVID, we saw a rise on online disinformation and conspiracy theories to promote this hate and violence. And these examples are very clear. But let's not forget, this is all geopolitically linked. When Trump made slurs like the Wuhan virus and the Chinese virus, it did catch on. And undoubtedly, the new Cold War tension has not helped at all. So while Biden may not use that rhetoric, his continuation of the policies of President Trump have undoubtedly contributed to this. And this is not dissimilar to what we've had over the last 20 years with the war on terror, with Islamophobia. So we've been here before already in our own living lifetime, certainly in my case. What adds to the race hate crime is that it's also seen Chinatown in London being affected by a downturn in trade when coronavirus first happened. And then there was also surveys done by Ipsos, if I can quote, which incredibly revealed that 1 in 7 people would avoid people of Chinese origin or appearance with the onset of coronavirus. So I think the coronavirus pandemic, combined with the new Cold War circumstances, have added to this. And if nothing else, we must be very, very observant about where this is going and put the right messages out. If I could highlight 2 things that we should look out for in the immediate future, I think with the COP26 happening in Glasgow, I suspect a lot of people are going to be pointing the finger at the Chinese contribution to CO2 emissions. The reality is, and it's a story which you're not going to hear too much, but I checked, the Chinese ability to reduce their emission is actually much better than people realize. It's been verified by a third party, the International Environment Agency, and I do think as and when that accusation is made about China, I think we need to deal with that in that way. The reality is Chinese bureaucrats only offer what they know they can achieve, whilst I think other countries, including Britain, it tends to be presentation and not substance. And I think there's a lot more substance in what the Chinese government's going to be doing on that front. The other one is a very London-specific thing. And I'm afraid it may become a local government issue next year. The Chinese embassy is in the process of moving from the West End, Great Portland Street, to the East End. And I'm very concerned about how people have been playing up that issue. The Chinese authorities have already bought the site. They need some planning issues to be sorted, and it's going to be conflated, unfortunately. There is actually a very bad history, I think, already of xenophobia in the UK. When my family used to have businesses in the West End, like Gerrard Street, it wasn't actually known as Chinatown because the original Chinatown was in Limehouse. And the Chinese businesses were actually pushed out of that part of town and to premises in the West End with people like my father who were willing to sell their leases to Chinese businessmen. I'm afraid in the London context, we're going to have to look out for that. And in a global context, the COP, I suspect there will be people that attempting to put a lot of pressure on the Chinese government to do more with their emissions. But actually, I think that they've got a better story than people realize. And I hope they get that through. And it doesn't add to the coronavirus allegations and the new Cold War tension that we have. And I think all elements dealing with racism in the UK and globally have got to acknowledge that this aspect of racism will undoubtedly, unfortunately, play a more prominent role than other forms of racism, whether it be Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and racism against Black people. This, unfortunately, is going to be the key form of racism that we've got to deal with head on. And I hope all my comrades and colleagues around the world will join me in that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Murad, for those fantastic opening remarks and for setting the context for this discussion. My name is Susie Gilbert and I'm with No Cold War Britain. I'm excited to introduce our next guest, but just to give you a little context on this campaign, No Cold War Britain is part of the No Cold War International movement, and we stand against racism, which we believe is being fueled by this new Cold War, rhetoric. We don't take a position on China. This is not a pro-China campaign. This is a belief in dialogue, in international cooperation, and we believe a Cold War against China is not a best of humanity. So you can find out more, and we welcome you to sign our statement at nocoldwar.org. And now to our second guest, who is Dr. Ping Hua, who is the ex-chair of the Chinese Association of Southampton. And she's served the local Chinese community for over 20 years. She's one of the directors of the Mingguan Legal Center, a charity based in London, supporting immigration issues and supporting hate crime victims. Ping is also a board member of TMG, the monitoring group, which was established in the early 80s, a leading anti-racist charity that promotes civil rights. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Susie, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Well, it is a little known fact that the Chinese community in the UK comprise the third largest ethnic minority, like individuals from other Black and ethnic minority groups. Chinese people have been arriving in the UK for generations. They share many concerns about the problems that individuals from other ethnic minority groups are facing, yet their experiences are radically different. The Chinese community is more dispersed across the UK compared to other ethnic minority, and is the second most likely ethnic group to be self-employed. A high proportion of them working in the distribution, hotel, and the restaurant industry. Beyond such demographics, they exist in British consciousness as a self-contained and a self-sufficient group. Little is known about the historical relationship between Britain and China, and the fact that Chinese individuals in the UK experience racism and are poorly represented in social and welfare policies. In raising the concern of a Black and ethnic minority group in the UK, the Chinese community have been largely forgotten. This is why the monitoring group undertook a project named Mingquan in 2006 to give Chinese community a chance to single them out and work closely with the victims of racism, domestic violence, and the police misconduct in order to find a solution that address their particular experience. So I've been working with the monitoring group since then. We witnessed how Chinese people in the UK were victimized in the face of racism and not giving the attention of the police, politicians, the media, and the public at large that their suffering deserved. As the outcome of the project, a seminal report titled Hidden from a Public View, showing the experience of racism suffered by the UK Chinese population was published, which covers area of Greater London, Hampshire, Lancashire, and Yorkshire. The report was launched in Parliament in 2009 by Sadiq Khan, the current mayor of London. There were 20 recommendations to central and local government, criminal justice agencies, schools, and other agencies. Unfortunately, all these valuable work were swept under the carpet due to changing of the government. So we are now witnessing an alarming rate of anti-Chinese racism globally, fueled by the racist narrative since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the warning from General Secretary of the United Nations that the pandemic actually continued to unleash a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating, and urge government to act now to strengthen the immunity of our society against the virus of the hate. Some government leaders and the senior officials have directly or indirectly encouraged hate crime, racism, and xenophobia by using anti-Chinese rhetoric, which has directly led to the murder of people of Chinese and East Asian origin in the US and the UK. Since the beginning of the new academic semester, racial incident against the Chinese and the Southeast Asian living in the UK has occurred ever more frequently. As an example, ongoing racist attacks have been taking place across Cambridge since the last couple of weeks ago from a suspected group of 9 to 12 young men. The group has reportedly been targeted at anyone who is Chinese in the Cambridge, shouting racially abused words, and some attacks have even become physical. Mr. Zhang, a 25-year-old Cambridge graduate, was a brutal attack on Sunday, 18th of September in the Co-op supermarket on Mill Road and was left needing facial surgery. It is suspected that the same group that attacks Mr. Zhang is continuing targeting other Chinese people in the area. The leader of the Cambridge Chinese Federation, Mr. Chen, has been living in Cambridge for 30 years, said he has never witnessed any racist attack like this before. He also said, these are intentional attacks on our Chinese community, and it is quite shocking. They are threatening violence against us, throwing things such as stones, drinks, and carry on an actually physical attack on us. Mr. Chen has had 9 attacks report to him within 3 days, and he wouldn't be surprised if there is more. These attacks are said to be targeted anyone who is Chinese, attack people as young as 15 years of age, and some family members too. According to Mr. Chen, the problem is escalating with more and more reports of these attacks happening daily. Victims are scared and come forward, are scared to come forward and to report to the police for various reasons, such as a lack of confidence in police, language barriers, and the fear of retaliation with the group because they are still at large. These attacks are affecting Chinese community in UK hugely, as it was reported all over the Chinese media, Chinese news around the world. Most of the Chinese students who just arrived in UK will be warned of taking care of their personal safety. Based on the information from Chinese Embassy in London, there are 216,000 Chinese students in the UK this year, and they contribute nearly £9 billion to our economy. And yet they couldn't even enjoy the basic human right of living in an environment without fear of their personal safety. At present, the Cold War mentality in the West is becoming even more prevalent, resulting in a spread of theory that China is a threat. A recent example in the program, China's Magic Weapon, broadcast by BBC. So this has highlighted that the rise of the recent hate crime targeted at ethnic Chinese in UK is directly linked to the Cold War mentality spread among some Western leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Peng, for the speech. The next guest is Mohammed Sohail, the Young Labour Northwest representative. Mohammed is a socialist activist and a trade unionist from Manchester, and currently sits as BAME officer on the Northwest Young Labour Committee. He's standing with 3 aims, which he believes are necessary to empower our activists, build our movement, and depend on our communities. So let's welcome Mohammed.
Hi, and thank you for having me. I'm really honoured to have been asked to speak at this rally. It's been a bit last minute, but hopefully the speech that I've got written for people resonates. Other panellists before me, and I'm sure after me, will continue and have spoken about the really vile racism that especially East and South Asian people, Southeast Asian people are seeing, and it's on the rise in the UK, unfortunately. and I'm very grateful for their expertise on it. I wanted my sort of few minutes to focus a bit more on how we can push back on imperialism and the imperialist project that we see in this clamour for a Cold War against China. As mentioned, I'm on the Young Labour National Committee. I'm the Northwest rep currently. And in that role, I had the privilege of working with people like Jess, Barnard and Abdullah, who was supposed to speak today, but unfortunately couldn't make it. And I'm continually inspired by their dedication to fight against imperialism across the world, and especially its manifestations for us in this country. I think particularly when we see things like the development of AUKUS, which is the new security coalition between the UK, the US and Australia, it can feel very disheartening. We start to question the movement and the power that the movement has, our anti-war, our pro-peace movement, and whether the world that we want to see be built and the world that we work so hard towards being built can actually come about, this peaceful, hopeful world. And those reservations are natural, and we see that there's this seemingly relentless march towards war being taken by especially Western nations, traditionally Russian imperialist nations, and really the evil that they've wrought across the world through their wars and their interventions. And it can sometimes feel that the powers against us are too much. But what I wanted to touch on today was how vital it was that we continue our fight, as I'm certain we will, and I hope the people who are on this call who've taken the time out of their evening to join this call will continue to do, and how vital it is that we continue to build an international global opposition to the aggression of the US, the UK, and other imperialist powers. In 2003, in February, in London, we saw millions of people take to the streets for a rally that was organised by the Stop the War Coalition. These people marched against the war in Iraq, which we now know resulted in the death of 1 million innocent Iraqi people, and contributed to the destabilization of a region that has subsequently led to the death of hundreds of thousands, probably millions more. What we sometimes fail to mention, not for any malicious reasons, but because we focus on the marches in the UK, is that similar rallies were held in over 600 cities across the world, and tens of millions of people did the exact same thing. In Rome, 3 million people took to the streets to march against the war, and that was the biggest rally that Rome has ever seen. Over 1 million people did the same in Madrid. I think it's fair to say that those rallies were probably the largest coordinated series of marches and protests maybe ever held, but definitely against imperialism and against that war specifically. Tragically, as we know, the February 2003 protests, they didn't prevent the war. They didn't alter the murderous paths of Tony Blair and George Bush and the rest of the security coalition who went ahead with war, and the consequences of which we still feel today. But as Seamus Milne wrote in 2012, it's no single rally, it's no single protest, and it's no single individual that's going to change the course that we're heading down. It takes a movement, and it takes a collection of marches. It takes groups and political organisation to form the processes by which those things are going to shift. And it's that what we have to remember. We have to keep the movement going. We have to keep it growing. We have to work with comrades across the world, as we're doing here tonight, because this issue is a global one. Our freedom in the UK the socialism which I fight for in the UK and my comrades fight for in the UK, it isn't just fight for justice on behalf of the working people of Great Britain, but for working people across the world and the peace that they hopefully will see in the future. That's why events like these are so important. We try to bring together the best and the brightest of our movement, not just the people who are speaking, but the people who, as I said, have taken their time out today to come to this event, and hopefully will take something from it and go forward with a research hope in their heart that we can see a world where there isn't a Cold War, but there's peace. And everybody here hopefully will continue to do that, because across the world, in our millions, there's people who believe in the things that we're saying today. We have to continue to build this international movement of peace and continue to fight for peace, and especially relating to the topic that we're talking about today, we have to continually fight against the imperialist hostility that we see being fought against, specifically China today, but other nations that are being attacked by Western imperial powers. I'm proud to be on a committee that time and time again has passed motions and held events in favour of peace across the world. My committee and myself, we proudly back the Palestinian people and their struggles for justice. We openly support wholeheartedly the Black Lives Matter movement, and we call for greater international support for refugees fleeing from violence and horror across the world, alongside a whole other things. And we definitely take the view that there should be no Cold War today. There should be no Cold War against China. And we worked hard to ensure that the committee is dominated by people who believe in the same things, who believe in that anti-imperialist project. Abdullah, who I spoke about before, who was meant to speak today, but unfortunately couldn't, he was going to touch on his role in the Black Lives Matter movement. And as hard as I could try, I could never do justice to the really wonderful work that he's done, especially in Sheffield, where he heads the local Black Lives Matter group. But I think what's important to note is that imperialism and the violence that we see, where people, where the UK and the US and Australia and other nations are clamoring to start a Cold War with China, it's not something that we're detached from. We see it, and it manifests itself at home as well as it does abroad. In this country, as we've spoken before about, and as panelists have spoken about previously, we see a state that treats ethnic minority people, particularly as we spoke about before, Southeast Asian and East Asian people, especially Black people in the UK, with utter disdain and complete hatred. The violence against them by the police, the murder and the harm that the police commit against these people. It doesn't only tragically affect the individuals, but it hurts our communities and it hurts our movements that we fight towards. And really, it's nothing more than an extension of what the US and what the UK and other imperialist powers are doing abroad and what they plan to do in this Cold War that they seem to be gunning for against China. I think I've been a bit quick, but I'll end now, but only by saying, I want everybody to know that I'm not pessimistic about the power of our movement. We need events like this. We need movements like this. We need to keep going and work with comrades across the world. We need to keep up the pressure against the new Cold War. And most importantly, we need to make sure that we never lose that fire within us that fights, shoulder to shoulder in solidarity for the cause of anti-imperialism and to stop the hopefully not impending Cold War. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. It's really great to have you, and thank you for those powerful sentiments for an anti-imperialist internationalist solidarity. So our next speaker is Anna Chen, who is a London-born writer, poet, and broadcaster, and Orwell Prize shortlisted blogger. Her documentaries for BBC Radio 3 and 4 are pioneering explorations of race and class, and they include the groundbreaking 10-part series, Chinese in Britain. She was also the coordinating press officer for the Socialist Alliance and the Stop the War Coalition. Over to you, Anna.
Hi, well, thank you very much for having me in the Cold War Britain, one of the few platforms to allow our Chinese Brits to speak. And I'm pleased to be not only one, but two members of the monitoring group who've been incredibly supportive in the 20 years that I've known them. And a big thank you to the Labour Conference, which just voted 70 to 30% against the AUKUS nuclear submarine up, which is a welcome sign during the past few years, ever since Trump unleashed his trade war on China and the Western world piled in opium wars too. So tonight I'm going to talk about how racism is more than an ugly word shouted at us, more than an assault on any individual. It goes wider than the gunshot massacre of Asian women in Atlanta. Racism is a poisonous force which could, on this trajectory, result in the murder of millions of human beings if the USA and the Western ally get the war for which they're busily manufacturing consent, throwing huge resources at it to get their way. I doubt many of us could name more than a hand of Chinese people in British public life, in politics, the art, science and the media. One explosive through this year was the tennis star Murad, who Piers Morgan is already poised to give her the Meghan Markle treatment. According to the 2011 census in the United Kingdom, there were over 433,000 Chinese people living here. So, are we? When was the last time I saw a Chinese British face or heard their voice the norm? We're almost entirely missing the culture and society, and that's not an accident. Anti-Chinese racism has been deeply embedded ever since the 19th century opium wars, when Britain industrial quantities of mass-produced opium.
Anna, forgive me for interrupting you. There's a bit of an echo, and I'm just wondering if this is a problem for folks, because I think we're not sure what the issue is. There's a bit of an echo. So to fix it, it might require you reconnecting. So I don't know if folks are happy to take a moment.
have someone else speak now, and I'll
okay, perhaps we should do that then, if that's all right with everyone.
I will come back, I promise.
Okay. Zilan, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
Yeah. Okay, our next speaker, Suresh Govil, is the director of the monitoring group and has been active in many campaigns, such as to help the families of Stephen Lawrence, Shahid Mubarak, and Victoria Clumby. And he is a regular columnist for The Guardian. So let's welcome Suresh.
Suresh, thank you, you're muted. Thanks.
I think you can hear me now, right? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. As I said, thank you for giving me the privilege of inviting me to this platform. This is about the 6th meeting that the monitoring group is speaking on with regard to the rise and spikes in hate crimes against Chinese and East Asian communities in UK and Europe. And if you look at the current crisis, and it is a crisis and it is an emergency, and it is time to act. It's not about just observing, it's actually responding to the challenge that exists today, which if we do not rise to it, we will see deaths of people on our mainland, and we need to prevent that. And I'm not being alarmist. I can tell you from working on issues to do with racism over the last 40 years, that the trends are very significant in terms of racism, spurred by domestic and global movements. Just look at the YouGov poll, a neutral poll conducted last year. And what that showed was that people from Chinese background living in UK are actually more exposed to racist comments than any other community in Britain. It found that 76% of ethnic Chinese questioned said they had experienced someone using racial slur directly against them at least on one occasion. 60% said that they had happened to them on multiple times, including threats, much higher percentage than any other against any other community. These findings were made public last year at a time when the British establishment was being forced to acknowledge its history of colonialism and modern day manifestations of state racism and violence. These findings confirm a really deep worrying trend that has started during the Brexit referendum. 84% of the Black minority ethnic people interviewed thought that racism in this country and in the capital has become much more prevalent and indeed much worse than in the last 10 years, with nearly 2 in 3, 64%, saying that they are treated differently because of their ethnicity or origin. People from Chinese background are more likely than any other minority group to report hearing someone imitate their accent or make negative assumptions about their behavior based on their ethnicity. Sky News survey showed the same picture, a rise of 29% of hate crimes against Chinese and South and East Asian communities in the period when the pandemic was the most glaring and alarming. Last year, the United Nations expressed concern over what it called a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, unleashed by the pandemic warnings that some government leaders were helping to fan the flames by employing anti-Chinese rhetoric. This is the United Nations. Our own group that has been dealing with racism day in and day out for over 40 years. We've worked in the Chinese community for the last 2.5 decades. Our figures of the last year show a spike in racially motivated hate incidents of over 500%. The main trigger of this increase is the xenophobic statements made by politicians and the media. These include incidents of verbal abuse, graffiti, threats against Chinese or East Asian communities, individuals queuing for food at supermarkets, physical assaults on the streets, city center, schools, children as young as 8-year-old being beaten up in schools and university campuses, criminal damage of businesses, arson attacks on their shops. There's a particular trend that is worrying, as illustrated by incidents where Chinese and East Asian women are targeted with racial abuse and sexual slurs. A grotesque incident where a Japanese woman I dealt with was greeted by the Chinese ni hao, sexually exposed, and then urinated upon by 3 men as she tried to pass them. I'll develop on this point much more in a minute, because I think it's a central issue that we need to deal with. At a macro level, there are a number of key areas that require greater acknowledgement and understanding by people who wish to challenge anti-Chinese or East Asian racism in the UK. The first, and I say this from experience, I came into this field because I was racially stabbed by racists when I was doing my A-levels in the 1970s. And our generation was brought up, Black and brown people, by being racially abused and challenging that. We must stop trivializing racism by individualizing it, which is what the government does and a lot of mainstream political parties do. Racism has always been and remain a political and structural problem. The state is the foundation, the arbiter, the developer of racism, including racism in its popular and individualistic forms. If one loses sight of this fact, it becomes an issue of prejudice between people. And I'm not saying that prejudice itself is not important or relevant, but we cannot challenge everyday racism unless you challenge the source of that problem. It is the state practice, policies, and laws that set the context for and create new ideologies and forms of racism. In this context, the racism suffered by the Chinese and East Asian communities is not new. The earliest records of anti-Chinese race riots in Britain are recorded over a century ago. And there are many instances in the last 30 years where we've seen that spike. For my second point, I would like to turn to our minds to the incident in March last year, the massacre in Atlanta. That killing took place in an Asian massage parlor. The shooter has said that he did not target the woman because of their race. Instead, he claimed to be a sex addict bent on removing temptation. Regardless of his denial, whether it is a lie or self-deception, it is obvious that he targeted these women because they were Asian. The intersection has always been a driving force in Western attitude towards Asia and Asian women who are routinely hypersexualized and objectified in popular culture. And this is indicative in the cases that we have at the moment, where neighbors, Chinese individual women are specifically targeted, and before they're racially abused, they are talked of as prostitutes and sex workers when there is no evidence of them being that. As we are talking of Cold War, where the drums of actual war are becoming even louder, we need to understand how that intersection begins to work, and we need to begin to acknowledge that. The thinker and academic Edward Said, an American of Palestinian origin, argued that British and French colonizers justified their conquest of the East with narratives of Oriental inferiority, docility, lust, and treachery. Said was mostly thinking about Middle East and North Africa and Arabs and Muslims, but this eroticizing narratives extend to the whole of Asia. The Oriental as the other is the mask that we slipped on many different people and for different reasons. The context brings me to my third point on the AUKUS agreement. it is noticeable that all three countries, US, Australia, and UK, involved here are either colonial states or settler colonial states. And these large exclusive economic zones are reminders of how they continue to exploit that legacy. This deal is an indication that protection of the respective exclusive economic zones will be further militarized, thus reinforcing the privatization of the resources of seas and oceans when they should be part of humanity's common heritage. We need to draw attention to the absurdity of United States involvement in security dialogue in the Asia-Pacific region. The US has no legitimate security interest in that part of the globe and is simply looking to confront, thereby contain China, which it perceives as a threat to US hegemony. The truth is that the United States finds itself unable to maintain its economic hegemony, which has been in steady decline, but the US military hegemony remains unchallenged. And for decades, the US has accounted for 40% of world military expenditure. As a declining empire, the US seeks to confront where it is strongest by fostering a new arms race in the Asia-Pacific region. The US-Australia UK agreement involves the sales of nuclear submarines that function using highly enriched uranium. This can be used to manufacture nuclear weapons. The agreement sets a precedent for trade in this uranium and thereby undermines armed control's efforts. This exposes the hypocrisy, glaring hypocrisy of the United States and Australia, which has previously been vocal on questions of non-proliferation when it suits their interest. It is possible that this precedent will encourage governments in India, China, Pakistan, Indonesia, South Korea, Japan, and others also to trade in this enriched uranium. Lastly, you cannot develop anti-racism at a domestic level. The epidemic of both inequality and sickness shows that you have to have a global response. In Britain, we need to unite different communities to overcome fear and build resistance so they are not atomized. We need to genuinely challenge and not play lip service to anti-racism. This issue is too important for us to lose. And the pandemic world shows that we need a new radical form of anti-racism. Asian acceptability has always been contingent in this country where Chinese communities are seen as good immigrants, or in America when they're so-called a model community. Calls to stop anti-Chinese hate or East Asian hate will have limited impact without an awareness of the enduring history and impact of colonialism and empire. And there is a history of resistance in the UK, which we need to foster and develop, including in the Chinese community. The examples exist if you see them. Only in the last 5 years, because of immigration raids, we and other groups closed Chinatown for 4 hours, 8 hours, and 12 hours because of the manner in which the immigration raids were seen as racist by the Chinese and other communities. On the 27th of November, between 1 and 3 p.m., we will start building that unity by calling a rally in Chinatown, and we have the blessing of workers as well as businesses to do that. We implore you to support us and join us and be speakers at that rally. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Suresh. That was amazing. Thank you. So powerfully said. And there are some great comments. Keep your comments coming, please, in the chat. Anna, should we try and go back to you and see how your audio is doing?
All right, we'll have one more go. I have to say that I thought as what Qureshi was saying, I couldn't get a cigarette paper between what what he said, and I think how things are. And the Monitor Group has a long track record of supporting the Chinese community. Has that echo gone, or is it still there?
Still there. Do you by any chance have a headset or any other way of joining us? Like
Gosh, this hasn't happened before.
iPad or even a
Let me
phone?
get the next speak on, and I don't know.
Great.
I'll go at the I mind if I'll go at the end and there's still
Okay.
with us. Okay, cheers.
So we'll go to Sheila, if that's all right. Thanks everyone for your flexibility, and sorry about that. So we'll go to Sheila Xiao, a co-founder of Pivot to Peace. Sheila is the co-founder of Pivot to Peace and an Answer Coalition member. And as a Chinese American and daughter of Chinese immigrants growing up in San Francisco Bay Area, this shaped her work in peace activism. Thank you very much for joining us. Over to you, Sheila.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say how incredible this panel has been. I've learned so much and just feel an immense amount of solidarity across our national borders here and across the world. So thank you for No Cold War Britain chapter for holding this extremely important event. And we know that it really is no coincidence that the rise in anti-Asian violence is happening in countries with a history of white supremacy, of a history of colonialism, of a history of racist exploitation, right? And while the US and Britain has its own history, it's sort of undeniable. And just based on everything that I've heard today, the legacy of exclusion, the legacy of discrimination, the violence against Chinese and Asian people as a common thread. And we see this not just in Britain and the UK, but Australia, Canada, all these other places. So why the resurgence now, and what is the context for this? And we've pretty much touched on a lot of this, but I just wanted to say that, you know, myself alongside concerned Chinese Americans and anti-war activists alike, we co-founded the organization Pivot to Peace because we were alarmed by this deepening hostility, US hostility and military reorientation towards China. And this has been the case since President Obama's plan called the Pivot to Asia in 2011, which prioritized military resources to build up capacity to encircle Asia. And many associate the rise with anti-Asian violence as a byproduct of Trump's racist China bashing and scapegoating, but the groundwork laid down by the new US military doctrine deeming China as the adversary has been in the way since 2011 and arguably earlier. And thus began this process of manufacturing consent by the American population to justify this potentially catastrophic military confrontation with China. And as we know, manufacturing consent for war requires that anti-China narratives dominate all of our spaces of intellectual discussion, intellectual debate, media, and pop culture. And we are seeing, you know, for example, in the US, Chinese international students and professors face unfair scrutiny and persecution, echoing a new era of McCarthyism, that simply being Chinese can deem you a foreign agent of espionage. And this was happening even before COVID-19. Today, Chinese international students, especially those in science, tech, engineering, and math fields, have either had their visas revoked or denied re-entry into the US despite being enrolled in US institutions. And the major and intended consequence of these aggressive policies is that Asian and Chinese people bear the brunt of this demonization, right? This is the crux of why we're seeing these hate crimes spike. And as the saying goes, Julie Tang, who is also a co-founder of Pivot to Peace, she often says, when the gun is pointed at China, it is us, Chinese and Asian people, that get shot first. So it must demonize so thoroughly, it must demonize China so thoroughly that even simply speaking in neutral terms about China can socially ostracize you. And because we live in a global world dominated by US hegemony with junior allies to US imperialism, we see this trend of demonization all around the world, thus affecting Chinese and Asian people in places where China bashing takes hold. And according to the Pew Research Institute, virtually every advanced country, which includes the UK, has seen a staggering rise in unfavorability towards China, with, of course, the massive spike in 2020. The scapegoating of China for the COVID-19 pandemic by former US President Trump merely triggered that groundwork laid by years of anti-China headlines and decades of anti-Asian racism and violence. And as of June 2021, over 9,000 hate crimes against Asian Americans have been recorded in the Stop AAPI hate database, which we know reported hate crimes are a severe undercounting of what actually happens in reality. And with the new military alliance of AUKUS, the demonization of China and racist violence will continue and has continued under Biden's leadership, President Biden's leadership. And in fact, Biden has pledged to even pass progressive reforms in the US in the name of competition with China, instead of the simple fact that working people in the US simply deserve these rights, simply deserve the right to live. After the horrific massacre, as mentioned, of the 6 Asian women in Atlanta, the brewing concern about rising hate crimes against Asians sparked a call to action. In March of this year, immediately after the massacre, Pivot to Peace, alongside the Answer Coalition, Code Pink, and over 70 other endorsing organizations, organized a national day of action under the unified banner of Stop Anti-Asian Violence and Stop China Bashing. Because we understood that, what happened in Atlanta inextricably links the connection between war and racism. And it was so much so the case that people understood this, that over 60 cities participated in this day of action. Community members, people who have never organized rallies before, called actions on this day. And as a Chinese American, it had been the first time I had seen such a collective outpouring of Asian Americans into the streets like what I witnessed on that day. And it's also important to note that many of the Chinese immigrants, and particularly Chinese international students in the US who came to the rally for the first time, actually came up to me and other organizers to thank us for addressing the China issue head on, the China bashing. Because nowhere in the mainstream media were people talking about that. We're making the links between anti-Asian violence and US aggression towards China. And our coalition for this day of action were some of the first to address this issue head on. And what this tells me, and in the same spirit as what Mohammed said earlier, is that there are hundreds and maybe even thousands more out there who have been silenced by this mainstream attitude towards China, but want to fight back. And we can do that work to get them to fight back. And the truth is, I think that everyday working people understand this message, that understand that war is not the answer, right? That in order to stop racism, we must stop the war drive. And we really should not underestimate the collective power we have to mobilize our people and put a stop to our resources being looted for yet another catastrophic military confrontation. And our job as organizers and people who genuinely want peace and want to stop Asian hate, to always make those connections between war and racism. And Biden and all of the mainstream politicians speak only in name against anti-Asian violence, but in their policies do not support such efforts. I don't think it's a coincidence that the outpouring of community activism among Asian Americans comes after the historic uprising against racist police terror on Black America after the brutal murder of George Floyd. This historic movement transcended our national borders, where solidarity actions across the world were taking place. And it was such a movement that helped demand even a tiny sliver of justice that caused the officer who killed George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, to be convicted. And any gain that we've ever won from our collective humanity and dignity was won through organizing and mobilizing in the streets. And in my 7 years of anti-racist and anti-war organizing, I can attest to what I feel is a qualitative shift in consciousness. And I also have a lot of optimism that we can fight back, and we will fight back. I don't know if you all have been sort of seeing the changes in mainstream media, but now I've really noticed that even media sites like the San Francisco Chronicle, Vox News, does have to acknowledge the fact that anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian violence is a microcosm of heightened US-China tensions. So I feel like our movement is working, even if it's just a little bit. And without a doubt, this is because of the work we all have been doing as people of conscience who have been working hard to mobilize voices around the world to stop this Cold War. And again, I am extremely honored to be speaking on this panel with my brothers and sisters in the UK. Our struggle against anti-Asian violence is undoubtedly a global one. And it means so much to me that as a part of the Asian diaspora that we are fighting back from all corners of the world against US military aggression. And I believe that we can win this fight against this new Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. That's a really good, nice, powerful speech. We're going to welcome next speakers, Madison Tang. He's a writer, organizer, and educator from South California. As a feminist and anti-imperialist and a staunch internationalist, she believes in the power of anti-colonial transnations working class solidarity to achieve collective liberation for all in opposition to the force of imperialism, capitalism, racism. And Madison is currently based in Idaho, is that correct? And can we welcome Madison? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to No Cold War Britain and No Cold War, the international campaign. Thanks to all those who organized this, including Fiona Edwards. I'm very grateful that we're able to honor victims of anti-Asian violence today and the impact of anti-Asian violence. So I'm going to share a little bit of slides to start. And might touch on a little bit of what Sheila was talking about because we work with Pivot to Peace a lot, value that partnership. So I wanted to talk about the ways that racism, in particular Orientalism, cannot be separated from imperialism and the West's hybrid war on China. And I'm with Code Pink's China's Not Our Enemy campaign. We are working to dismantle US-led aggression on China in the war on China. So this is a kind of a simple little diagram with the imperial tree of death and destruction just in time for Halloween times. Showing some of the branches of imperialism. There are many others, but all of these factors intersect with imperialism. And in particular, racism and white supremacy. I know we talked a little about the patriarchal elements, heard from Suresh about the Atlanta shootings and imperialism as conquest of a land, especially its women. But I wanted to talk more about Orientalism as a moral justification for war and dehumanization of the other as a precondition for that. So the knowledge that we have in the West, including the UK and the US, and some of what I will say today will extend to Britain and the British Empire. I'll try to point that out when it's relevant. But essentially all the knowledge we have from whether that's school education from textbooks or mainstream media, which is often parroting State Department narratives that are warmongering in nature, we cannot necessarily trust that any of that foundation is neutral without taking a deeper look into sources and biases. So the intersection of imperialism and Orientalism is particularly dangerous and deadly historically and today. And this intersection makes a potent, dangerous combination We see projection, we see dehumanization and disposability, we see a lack of context, historical erasure and revisionism. A lot of US schools today still teach that the US won the Vietnam War. A lot of schools do not teach about the Asian Holocaust that Japan inflicted on a lot of Chinese civilians. There's lack of contact, especially in the US during the Chinese Exclusion Act. Over half a century of no Chinese immigrants being legally allowed to enter. Lack of visibility. A lot of Asian American Pacific Islander communities in the US, their information is not disaggregated in data and census because they're just lumped into one group. And we know that that causes issues for class disparities between different immigrant groups and different ethnicities. And there's a pressure on Asian American communities to be the model minority in opposition to Black and Brown communities, meaning to be depoliticized, to be obedient, quiet, and not cause trouble. In essence, this is a tool of ruling class and white supremacist forces to keep people of color divided within our social conditions. And of course, information warfare we see from politicians and from the mainstream media, a mass demonization campaign, and a lot of scapegoating of China and its culture. And so I wanted to touch also on psychological projection, the psychological definition of what this concept is, denying impulses or qualities in oneself, attributing to another. It's seen as a defense mechanism and a projection of general guilt, projection of a severe conscience linked to making false accusations, very closely tied to scapegoating. So in many ways, China is the perfect foil, a foreign, non-white, non-capitalist scapegoat for the West and for Western empires in 2021. In order to justify past colonial conquest of China, and in order to manufacture consent for ongoing imperialist aggression towards China, the Western imperialist bloc and ruling class projects onto China, its government, its culture, and its people. We see even in Congress accusations made against Chinese culture as a whole. It extends to that level so quickly, from attacks of the Chinese government to the culture of Chinese people. And this manufactures selective outrage, where there's an intense focus and fixation on China and flaws within China, as opposed to some neutrality of all of the issues globally among many other nations. And it deflects and distracts from crimes against humanity and the planet perpetrated by Western empires like the US and Britain. The West has immiserated and mass pillaged Central, East, South, Southeast Asia for centuries. Colonialism, imperial wars, resource extraction, unequal trade, loan structures. The first Opium War alone claimed only 500 some British casualties compared to an estimated 20,000 Chinese killed or wounded. The war on Korea, US planes dropped more bombs than during the entire Pacific campaign against the Japanese during World War II. All of this kind of information that is not public knowledge, not taught commonly. And so I also want to talk about racism and anti-Asian racism in the US today. This is the National Stop AAPI report of anti-Asian violence and incidents. So that extends from, it's more than 9,081 incidents between March 19th, 2020 to June 30th, 2021. So they have extended the report to June. And you can see here the percentage of victims who identify as Chinese. We know that most of the incidents were rooted in xenophobia and targeted Chinese and Chinese Americans. Anti-Asian violence increased 194% in the first quarter of 2021 compared to 2020. And this pattern of heightened xenophobia and scapegoating of a minority group as a corollary to US imperialist wars is not new and must be challenged. what we can see from this close-up of the report, which you can find on their website, is the near impossibility of separating anti-Asian hatred from an anti-China sentiment. So what you see at the top is that 48.1% of the incidents included at least one hateful statement regarding anti-China or anti-immigrant rhetoric. The implications for the treatment of Asians in the US, as reflected by the use of anti-China statements. Essentially, there's no way for an assaulter to know if a Chinese American target is supportive of their country of origin or its system of government. So many of these are public incidents where the assaulter is a stranger. And furthermore, many attackers cannot differentiate between East and Southeast Asian ethnicities, much like how Sikh communities were mistakenly targeted with Islamophobic violence in the aftermath of 9/11 and the buildup to the US invasion of Iraq. So these themes are not mutually exclusive. You can see some of the themes here. And another important factor is the ways that the kinds of anti-Asian racism and microaggressions in this report get commonly overlooked, dismissed, misunderstood, ultimately gaslit when Asian communities try to speak up about them, whether they're stereotypical slurs, erasure, shunning, suspicion. So this report was very important in naming all of those microaggressions, giving some authority to victims as they report these incidents, and kind of destigmatizing types of racism that are often, like I said, very much dismissed, and there are gaslighting techniques employed. So that happened very similar with the Atlanta shootings, where, as other speakers have talked about, there was a push by the FBI and the county sheriff to remove the racial motivation element, even though it was reported in South Korean papers, Chosun Ilbo, that the shooter shouted, "I'm going to kill all the Asians" before firing. So there is an effort to just completely remove the racial element. So for our strategy in the US, we do see international solidarity as a huge element. We're disrupting propaganda, educating the public on erased history and contradictions in the media, advocating legally, and building intersectionally, internationally, and intergenerationally, which is why this is so important here today. And these are just some photos of the National Day of Action that Sheila actually mentioned against anti-Asian violence and China bashing, March 27th. What was remarkable about this was that it was such a big moment for anti-imperialism and anti-racism, intersectional organizing and movement building to address both anti-Asian racism and China bashing. It was multiracial, it was intergenerational. Many first-generation Asian Americans and elders came out to what was one of their first protests. And we stressed at these marches across US cities and even extending to some international cities like Auckland, New Zealand, that the increasing incidence of anti-Asian violence in the US stems not just from xenophobic scapegoating of China, but also from the ongoing legacy of US imperial conquests in Asia. So the right is in LA, the left is in Queens, where they also honored Christian Hall, who's a victim of police violence in Flushing. I'll just leave this for a second, and we have a webinar coming up tonight, the second to last point, on McCarthyism of the 1950s, anti-Asian hatred, including discussion of Vincent Chen and Wenho Lee. So feel free to check out that event tonight, and it will be recorded on our YouTube.
Thank you so much, Madison. And as you did, do check out the resources on the CodePink website. That was amazing, an amazing slideshow. So we'll now go to Wapiao Tang, who is a retired barrister, a human rights lawyer, a Singapore exile and activist residing in the UK. He is the founder of Monsoon's Book Club and Universal Common Sense. Thank you. Just a reminder to unmute, please. Thank you. And if you can unmute.
Yep, I have unmuted. Can you hear?
Yep.
Okay, Right, I shall work on the basis of what Qureshi and Sheila Xiao had described on a global perspective of US imperialism and relationship with China, and on the Madison Tang's characterization of the scapegoating of Chinese. She mentioned three aspects, being foreign, non-white, non-capitalist. There's one other category that was mentioned about why Chinese ought to be hated, and that was during the period of the Opium War, that they were non-Christian. In more recent times, even in the British Parliament, and I believe in Mike Pompeo's document on the essence of the Chinese challenge, the term activism was also mentioned. And these are the people whom the Americans should love to hate. Now, the issue that I am trying to address is, can you hear? Hello?
Yes, we can hear, thanks.
Oh, you can hear, okay, good. The issue that I'm trying to address is what happened once the pandemic is over? What is to replace the incidents that would stir up more racial hatred? And my own prediction is that it could be worse than what we have already seen in the last 2 years. The reason is that we have now warships, gunboats, and British newest aircraft carrier in the South China Sea. And now Australia is roped in with a nuclear-powered technology for a nuclear-powered submarine, although that will come into action only probably 10 years from now, by the time it is built. It is building up a sense of tension in the South China Sea, that something would break out. Even Macron of France was pushing for some kind of Western alliance with Japan and India. Now, but we know that there is no issue about free trade. When Boris Johnson made his speech in, I believe, Portsmouth, to launch the journey of HMS QE2, the Far East, he mentioned that we are there to protect free trade, to protect democracy and our way of life. But if anyone who have followed the Bloomberg in the last 1 or 2 months, you will realize that there is no issue of free trade at all in Southeast Asia. In fact, all the capitalists in Wall Street, the London Stock Exchange, they're all worried that China is not producing goods fast enough to fill up the shelves in London, in the things that's needed in the factories in the United States, and so on. So the question of the Cold War, the question of the need to protect free trade is a myth. And why is that myth needed? Because they need big gunboats. They don't want to put boots on the ground. And this is where this proxy war in the South China Sea would turn ugly once there is a skirmish, once there's an accidental war. And this will be translated if there's a British soldier get killed in the process, an American, then you can see the intensity of racial hatred will be greater, and that is my fear. Now, US is not, if I may deviate in my analysis from that of medicine. US is not doing an aggression against China. In fact, it's the reverse. They are playing a defensive act. And why are they playing a defensive act? It's because the Chinese managed to integrate a system of strong state control with the creativity of capitalism. And that is a model which appears to produce the goods that people want. And it is no wonder that lots of people in third world countries welcome the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. I've been looking at studies in the United States think tank, both of the right and of the left, and their conclusion is similar. You are unable to match the Chinese investment dollar by dollar. But in fact, the Chinese investment ended up to be just about 3 to 4 trillion, which is just about what the US spent since 9/11 on the Middle East and Afghan war. But the think tanks in America realized that they are unable to get any private capital to invest in similar projects. And this is the threat of China to the US hegemony. And the only person, at least the only person that I came to know working on this is, interestingly, one of the billionaires from the Bridgewater Fund. I believe they are worth 136 billion. And he is one of the strongest advocates of cooperation with China. And he did put his money where his mouth is by investing in China. Only recently, he was talking about China as a place that no serious investors can afford to avoid. Capitalists like him accepts the need to recognize this tectonic shift in world system. In fact, he is about to publish a book, which is a study of 500 years of capitalism. And what he sees is when the Spanish replaced the Portuguese, when the Dutch replaced both, when the British replaced all the rest of the European capitalists, and then subsequently the Americans. And now is that tectonic shift of China, and United States is playing a reactionary role to stop this advancement. And it will be more vicious than even what they did to destroy Cuba and so on. Now, the problem is, for me, unfortunately, almost all British and European parliamentarians believe in the Cold War myth of Uncle Sam, that China is a threat to international trade, to rule of law, and to democracy. Now, if that were the case, we might as well believe what Donald Trump said recently, that Biden's 3.5 trillion Build Back Better infrastructure scheme is a communist plot to destroy America. It is as ridiculous as that. Now, the problem is, we who are in the anti-hate campaign, while we can make connections with British MPs, with politicians, and so on, where no one can deny that hate crime is bad. But when it comes to hate crime, which would eventually be generated as the consequence of the new Cold War, that is where we will run into problem. because the new Cold War is run apart from the myth about free trade and so on, is on the myth that we are involved in hitting China to advance the issue of democracy. And this is where even among my friends who had worked with me for the last 40 years had problem in accepting that we need to challenge this new Cold War. Now, our task of fighting against the hate crime becomes more challenging, therefore, once the pandemic recedes. Increasing economic rivalry between the United States and China, as I explained, has already gave rise to a new US instigated Cold War. And Biden administration had allocated $300 million for this task, and that includes learning of Chinese language and so on for all their operatives. And they are also building up the language, the political language and culture to justify this new Cold War, which is couched in the language of pseudo-ideological differences over the question of democracy, governance, and the rule of law. Now, what are we going to do with this problem? Now, among those who are our potential allies in the campaign against hate crime, many would have strong competing views over the question of China. Lucy is right that we are not here to defend China. Not everything that China does we need to defend, whether it is Xinjiang or anywhere else, it does not matter. But to recognize the common ground, it's important for us to expand further the work of the anti-hate crime campaign and No Cold War, so that we can aim to be able to coexist under one umbrella. But what are the common points that we can hope to present to be acceptable and agreeable? And I think that one of the things that we need to accept is all countries, East and West, suffer from a deficit of political representation within their respective political framework. Everyone will agree that this applies in the case of China. Even one of the foremost Chinese political scientists who was from the 1989 generation and now very much relaxed, whether it's in Tsinghua University or Harvard University, did make a critical appraisal that there is a deficit of political representation in China. But we can say the same about this country, and we can say the same about the United States. Can any one of us, can human rights defender honestly believe that the United States of today, the government, is a government for the people, by the people, of the people? I'm sure it has deviated very, very far from that. So if we recognize that both the West and the East has this similar deficit of political representation, what moral right does human rights defenders have the right to want to impose a system of law, a philosophy that applies to us, but not necessarily applies to elsewhere? We can go into this at some other time, but very shortly, I would say that Western democracy, the jury system, the emphasis on autonomy developed at the time, 500 BC, at a time when there were city-states where a population that concerns the intellectuals were 200,000. The fort was at the highest point of the land with the wall to defend against intruders. They could afford to have the emphasis on the individuals and so on. At the same time, in China, the intellectuals were addressing issues of big floods, issues of famine, issues of how to choose an emperor where you rule over a few million people. It's a completely different scale and context where philosophically they emerge with the philosophy of the need to choose the right people, the righteous people, and so on. It could be, it was feudal and so on, but that was a feudal period. We need to accept that there are these differences, and if we can, then that can be one ground for our common basis for work. The second is that nations should cooperate as equal regardless of ideology. Now, this was an idea advocated in 1956 at a conference in Bandung in Indonesia. And from China, Zhou Enlai traveled there to make his speech. Nehru went there, but the CIA almost blew up the plane that Zhou Enlai was about to board. Now, that was a philosophy adopted by the non-alliance countries, that nations should cooperate as equals regardless of ideology. And to some extent, it is my personal hope that China would also adopt the spirit of Bandung, because one of the ideas of Bandung conference was that countries, big or small, should be treated as equal among each other. So no question of hegemony. Third is we will oppose any new Cold War because it increases the risk of a nuclear war. And although no one go into, probably Trump would, but the risk of a nuclear war is heightened once you have the militarization of the South China Sea. The fourth point is that China, given its size and outreach, is an indispensable part of the world economy. Whether you like Xi Jinping or not, whether you like the Chinese for being 80s majority or not, it is an indispensable part of the entire world economy. A new Cold War would decouple the Chinese economy from the West and thereby hurting all countries. Now, in the last 2 years, I traveled to all the countries in Southeast Asia, and I see with my own eyes, and I spoke to people, even countries as poor as Bangladesh, how they had benefited from Chinese investment. Of course, Chinese capitalists are capitalists. They can't shed away the enigma of a capitalist, but they brought opportunities, and these are issues which countries should resolve when they invite Chinese investment. But the Cold War would disrupt this opportunity that China offered a ladder for countries to climb out of their poverty. I'm from Singapore. Singapore is a rich country. I went to Philippines last year, and the Chinatown of Philippines looks the same as the Chinatown of Philippines in the 1930s. And what happened to US capitalism in developing the Philippine economy? None at all. And I think the same we can say about Latin America. And this is where a new Cold War would disrupt the opportunity for many third world countries to climb out of their poverty. And lastly, is a new Cold War is a distraction from the common fight against climate change. Whether you like China or not, whether China is democratic or not, it has done something positive, and that's the point that Suresh, I believe Suresh mentioned in his speech, that there are real efforts on the Chinese side. Whether there are real efforts or not, China is an entity that one needs to incorporate. So these are the 5 reasons I feel we should develop and expand our comrades and organizations who can work with us. A meeting of this nature, probably we attract 300, but maybe we should go for much, much more, because the problem is so great that we have to reach out to many. In fact, one of the Amnesty International coordinator, my very dear friend for 30 years, telephoned me. She's in her 80s, and she is in the dilemma of how to respond. I sent her my analysis of China.
Sorry to interrupt you, just to give you a heads up about time, we're a little bit over time.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah, okay, I think I'll finish here to say that I've sent her my analysis about China, and she is at great pains in trying to resolve her one yardstick to measure a country, and that is that of human rights as we understand. Thank you very much. Sorry to have exceeded the time.
It's all right. Thank you. Thank you, Hua Bao. Thank you for sharing your insight of your knowledge with us. We are going to go to Aidan from the Stop Asian Hate UK. It's a grassroots anti-racism movement which was created in March 2021 to bring together members of the East and Southeast Asian community in the UK. It aims to uplift and celebrate the East and Southeast Asian community while raising awareness of the rise in anti-Asian hate and demanding change and reform. So let's pass you to Aidan. Thanks.
Thank you, Zilan. Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much to all the speakers who've just spoken. That's really, really informative. And yeah, I'm really enjoying this so far. Hi all, I'm very glad to be on here to speak with you all today. And it's great to be seeing so many people attending. Thank you very much to Fiona and to No Cold War for your invitation. I believe I've been asked to offer my perspective as a young member of the Asian diaspora in the UK, the Facebooking, the YouTubing, the TikToking generation. And I'm speaking also on behalf of Stop Asian Hate UK, which I like to think about more as a movement led by the whole ESEA community here in the UK rather than an organization. It started off as a Facebook group earlier on this year in those few days of shock and what seemed to be a perpetual never-ending silence following that dreadful shooting in Atlanta where 6 women of Asian descent were murdered. And it quickly snowballed somewhat into some kind of community hub where we share news, resources, events, and try to get this already fragmented ESEA community here to stand on some form of common ground. Even though Stop Asian Hate UK exists mainly on social media spaces, we managed to simultaneously organize 3 protests around the UK in July to raise awareness on the steep rise of anti-Asian racism. So a little bit about my own background. I have been based in London for the past 4 years now, but I was born and raised in the Republic of Ireland. My parents are both indigenous Hakka Chinese people from villages in the New Territories up in Hong Kong. And my dad, he moved to the UK when he was a boy in the 60s. Wow. Making him part of the earlier waves of the Hong Kong Chinese migrants who settled in the UK. The takeaway generation, so to say. Even though I've always been interested in exploring diasporic identity and was raised with an already quite anti-imperialist tendency at home, it really wasn't until just before the first lockdown here in the UK around March 2020, when anti-Asian hate crime statistics began to soar in the West. And I suppose for the first time in my life, I had really personally experienced hate crimes directed at me just because of my heritage, just because of the way I look, that I really began to examine my identity as an East Asian person living in the West. I realized that, you know, my privilege, so to say, was so conditional, you know, and granted to me, I guess, by white society. And we didn't have so much agency to define ourselves and our own rights within society. So yeah, lockdown happened. I began reading up on a plethora of different subjects that would have shaped my identity through my heritage. For example, British and Western imperialism, not only in Hong Kong, but around the world, and also in Ireland, where I grew up. I learned a lot about Chinese diasporic history around the world, and of course, read up on Orientalism as coined by Edward Said in his famous 1978 book of the same title. It was around this time that I grew interested in learning more about Marxist revolutionary movements, about their anti-imperialist struggles, how Western imperialist powers have depicted and treated communism, note McCarthyism, especially during the Cold War of the previous century. And I was able to find some uncanny parallels that could be drawn between and the Western aggression towards China today and in the past decades after the fall of the USSR in 1990, where we've seen the PRC's rapid rise to become one of the world's superpowers and largest economies, much to the spite of some other countries. I can't help but to see this harking back to the yellow peril imagery so prominent to the West, in the West 150 years ago. It's quite striking, really. Over the past 15 years of my 22 years of life, I've been to visit all around mainland China several times. And it's always bothered me to see how the country, its people, once sacked and impoverished by Western imperialists, they're constantly dehumanized and unfairly depicted by the same people in 2021. I'm also bilingual, so I can safely tell you that, you know, most reports of what's the CCP doing now really comes from translation inaccuracies, intentional or not, as well. And it's just mildly infuriating. People can be so desperate to force things into a certain narrative, and all politics aside, this is giving rise to something that is particularly distressing to my fellow members of the East and Southeast Asian diaspora in the West. For example, in early 2020, this is common knowledge, but Trump's insistence on using the term China virus and consistent accusations of the Chinese government for hiding the virus directly coincided with a steep rise in anti-Asian hate in the West. In Britain, it was up to a staggering 3 times more in the first quarter of 2020 compared to the same quarter of 2019 and 2018. That's from Metropolitan Police reports. And that was just reported cases from a demographic which famously does not report things as well. So that's pretty dire. And just these past few weeks, we've seen this spate of assaults targeted towards Chinese students in both Cambridge and up in Sheffield. How can we ignore the complicity of those who push Orientalist and anti-Chinese narratives? When people say, I hate your government, but I love your people, it's such a lie. It's a given fact that East Asians, like most other minority groups in the West, were seen as a monolith, and those who are so desperately pushing this new Cold War narrative onto us are directly responsible for all of those who have been murdered, who have been raped, who have been maimed, who've been assaulted, who've been degraded and dehumanized as a result. They've got blood on their hands, and we have to acknowledge that. We have to call them out. Much like how we as anti-racists must keep educating ourselves on the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and how it still directly feeds into the oppression of Black people in the US even till today, I firmly believe that regardless of our own political persuasions, we must acknowledge the effects of this new Cold War narrative on the rise of anti-Asian racism in the West and how it affects us before we stand up and proclaim Stop Asian Hate. Thank you very much to everyone. I've been really looking forward to this talk. And with that, I think I'll hand back this metaphorical mic. Thank you and solidarity to all.
Thank you. So we're now coming to our final couple of speakers, and we're running a couple of minutes behind time. We're now going to go to Michaela Erskog. Michaela is part of the Coordination Committee for No Cold War International, a peace platform pushing for maximum global cooperation at a time when US governments' aggressive policies and actions against nations like China threatens humanity. Mika is also part of Pan-Africanism Today, a working class movement-driven education and solidarity organization based in South Africa. And she works in the interregional office of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and is part of Dongsheng News, a collective of researchers interested in Chinese politics and society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, awesome. Greetings to everyone who's joined us and my fellow panelists. It's been fantastic to hear all the contributions. I'm really glad to be participating, especially because most of you have covered a lot of the ground that I usually would do in like 2 hours. And in a 7-minute thing, it's really helpful for you all to have contributed the way you have. So, as my speakers have already mentioned, and I think this is really important because again, as she mentioned, I'm not from the Asian diaspora, I'm not from Asia, I'm an African woman, but I want to talk to the people also who might be in this conversation or on this call or viewing this panel who don't think that anti-Asian racism relates to their lives. I want to talk and kind of give a bit of a picture of the fact that any form of racial discrimination or any variety of forms of discrimination in the world we live in today has an effect on all of us. And it's only through international solidarity and trying to figure out building the steps towards international solidarity amongst the people's organizations, amongst working class people, amongst the most affected, that we're actually going to do something that changes things. So there are two things I wanted to quickly touch on is one, racism as it relates to, the imperialist Western project of domination that has largely served to underdevelop the global South and the majority of the world's people. And two will be around, as I mentioned, international solidarity and how we kind of work against this racism and what it might look like. So as folks have already said, we can't really understand anti-Asian hate and racism unless we confront the remnants of the long history of Western domination in the form of colonialism and the forms of contemporary neo-imperialism. And one of the examples I just want to raise that from people in the African continent who often don't necessarily think that these things affect them, one of the elements that I want to raise is anti-Arab racism or anti-Muslim racism, because in many ways, as we've seen with the retreat in Afghanistan, it has had hugely devastating implications, and the role of racism in that project has fundamentally ruined the lives of millions of people in the Middle East, but in fact has also had a really problematic and negative effect and impact on the people in the African continent, for example. And when we're looking at the African continent, few people on the continent, let alone outside the continent, realize that the process of demonization, criminalization of the people of the Middle East has actually increased the proliferation of arms, has increased the military presence of Western foreign powers on the African continent. And many, who believe in this kind of neoliberal dream say, this is super helpful. We're getting all these arms. We're increasing our security impact. But the stats and the data show that the presence of US and historically colonial powers, namely France, namely to some extent, Germany and Portugal and others, the presence of these foreign militaries has only actually escalated conflict in Africa. And Western powers in many ways have just been protecting the kind of flows of capital, the security of certain economic projects, and have just swooped in and ensured that they maintain their monopoly on the mineral extraction of Africa's wealth. And with the rise of anti-Arab racism, it's only been easier because they use this kind of anti-terrorist security threat to swoop into areas. I mean, I think it was in January of this year, the US State Department went to Congo, to the DRC, and they designated a very minor rebel group as an anti-terrorist group. This is the same group who, the different UN and these kind of official bodies had investigated and showed that they have no connection to ISIS, they have no connection to any kind of organized international terrorist group. But the US felt it significant that they should swoop into this moment and secure not only the fact that there was a new presidency and they needed to build relationships, but it actually happens to be adjacent to one of the biggest oil reserves in the DRC. So, I'm just trying to make the connection between, everyone has spoken about imperialism, but this kind of rise of anti-Arab racism, how it connects to terrorism. And then all of a sudden in Africa, we're asking these questions. Why is there this promulgation of military forces from the US? It's all very much connected. And on the other hand, another important issue, and why I think I'm part of this panel, is that anti-Chinese sentiment is used to scapegoat the issues of neocolonialism and imperialism, as well as our corrupt and horrifying African governments who refuse to deal with the problems they've produced or refuse to find a radical alternative that could serve the people in their countries. And one of the ways that we've seen over the last 20 years more recently has been the fact that in many cases, a lot of African elites use anti-Chinese sentiment to get into power, which we've seen in Zambia with Michael Sata in 2006, who basically pushed this politics of differentiation in order to gain power. And two, and this relates again to racism, is why is it that Australian, American, Canadian, all of those kinds of multinational companies and commercial ventures in Africa never receive the same amount of attention or targeted investigation or flack as Chinese companies or Chinese commercial ventures? Because in the DRC right now, there's been this huge push again, largely funded by African elites, largely funded by African media, largely funded by Western organizations against Chinese people and Chinese organizations. And it's because fundamentally the global economic order is founded on white supremacy, is founded on that kind of relationship between the dominator and the dominated. And I think especially at least for me with African people, we need to start to make this very clear that racism, anti-Asian racism, and all other forms of discrimination are directly connected to a longer historical power structure that seeks to completely obliviate any power that the ordinary person can have in the influence of the way their country is governed. And so what do we do about this, right? This is the question. And I mean, many different speakers have already given us different answers of how we mobilize and organize. And I want to speak about it from two approaches, because one is anti-racist work today has largely, at least in the African context, been handed over to our governments and to so-called global leaders. And if I can just give one example where time and time again, we've been shown that the global leaders will not actually deal with the people's problems and with the issues of racism, it was in July, the United Nations Human Rights Council, they adopted this landmark resolution on racism, on, creating independent mechanisms for uprooting the kind of embedded racist structures that come from slavery, colonialism, etc. And the group of African states pushed really hard for this resolution and pushed for like investigations and different steps to be taken that would be really proactive, even if it's on a kind of minimal liberal kind of ideological perspective. But yet in the UN, we saw how any potential transformative outcome of these policies was completely besieged by Western forces. The United States and the country where most of you are based, Britain, the United Kingdom, hesitated and pushed back, in fact, in the background, to the assessment that we need to look at the past, look at the legacy of slavery, look at the legacy of colonialism, look at the questions of reparations. And these governments basically removed all and any requirements that would actually investigate any systematic racism in US law enforcement and previous historical moments. So the UN bodies and all kind of equivalent groups show no ability to resist US empire and kind of, elite Western forces. And therefore, this is my kind of closing plea to everyone who's with us, is we have to reinforce the strength of people's organizations, of working class organizations, of people on the ground. And as I think it was Mr. Tan said, about common ground, we also need to resurrect common history we share. The fact that at the end of the day, come what may, the inaugural relationship, as Mr. Tan mentioned, between China and Africa, for example, was at the Bandung Conference in 1955. We shared and came together on the basis of a common history of colonial exploitation, colonial humiliation, colonial oppression. And in fact, that same spirit, I think, definitely needs to be pulled back again and remembered, because there is a misinformation about this common history and about the Tazara Railway, where China funded in the 60s and 70s, the building of infrastructure, the fact that the moment when Kwame Nkrumah, the first independence leader of Ghana, was being attacked and was under coup, Zhou Enlai decided he will continue and go and visit him and go and see him. When Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in the DRC by the CIA, Chinese people held rallies in China in support of the Congolese people. These are some of the histories we need to resurrect and show that we have common cause, not only because our suffering is very similar today, not only because, as others have mentioned, China has been able to lift people out of extreme poverty in a continent like mine where poverty is extremely pervasive, but we also have common cause in our aspirations towards, a denuclearized, peaceful, as I'm sorry to say it, as Xi Jinping said, common prosperity, that I think even just as a gesture, even if you don't believe in his politics, as a gesture, it's more than what we get from the likes of, Anthony Blinken and all the kind of US apparatus that promulgate war, fear-mongering, desperation, and racism. And so in order to strengthen, people's organizations, of course, we need to link internationally. And I just want to invite all of those who are part of this. I'm part of various groups in Africa who are part of the International People's Assembly. And we recently publicly launched, after a process of 6 years, figuring out how, peasants, feminists, trade unions, advocacy groups can link together and start to produce common programs of action that fight racism, that fight imperialism, that fight capitalism. But I'd invite you all to kind of join us, follow us, see how we can figure out plans to fight what ultimately would be a devastating situation if this new Cold War escalates. And so because our fates of everyone here, of people across the world, are increasingly more interconnected, I'll just end with saying that ultimately, and this is an old trade union thing that we do in South Africa, is an injury to one is an injury to all.
Beautiful, Mika, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And as you say, please check out the International People's Assembly website, and the link is in the chat. So over to our final speaker, Anna Chen. Let's see if how your audio is doing.
One last go. Has this 1 2 1 2? How's that? Is that better? Because I'm down the internal speaker, which normally turns itself off. Is it still bad?
It's still echoing.
I'm really sorry. Then I don't know technically what I can do.
It's better.
Okay, good. If you think it's better, then let's go ahead and maybe you can speak slowly.
What have we got? 5 minutes left. Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. The bar has been set so high, brilliant, and I've got this feeling which I recognise as happens. I'm going to try picking this up from the opium wars. I think we all know now that the anti-Chinese racism has been deeply embedded ever since the 19th century wars, when Britain grew industrial quantities of mass-produced opium in stolen Bengal and fought at gunpoint onto the entire Chinese nation, and turning what had been an expensive upper class license into a nationwide addiction. And since then, we've subsequently made invisible as fully rounded human beings, with only the most debased yellow depictions allowed. So Sax Roma's evil mastermind Fu Manchu, massive lotusisms, and sexually perverted goons reside deep in our unconscious, as do house slaves, sidekicks, and underlings to the white group. And this absence of representation creates a vacuum where we're an unknown, mysterious entity. It turns us into a blank canvas onto which anything can be projected, mostly from the West's own history. And now that Western economies are in trouble, all those neuroses and fears, furies, and anxieties need somewhere to go. Chinese were included would be humanized, shown to possess an inner world and have a capacity for love and altruism, something that we've seen as denied us, willingness to care for our fellow human beings and to act responsibly for the welfare of the planet. Instead, we've been kept out of the general consciousness and invisible until one's formed into a permanent reservoir of scapegoats. And that reservoir of scapegoats is what's being tapped into now. So this geopolitical calamity has been looming for years. I mean, Pilger even made his film The Coming War on China in 2016, with what US and its Western sidekicks ticking off missions they don't like one by one. Yugoslavia, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, Russia, and so many more. And it was clear that the end of this list is China, the juicy prize for the imperialism, and China as the newly rich kid wearing a Rolex wandered onto mafia turf. So in order to get a war, the US has had to find a casus belli to get, according to their think tanks, taxpayers on board for conflict. An excuse for a hot rather than a cold war on China. Weapons of mass destruction, the pretext for invading Iraq in 2003. The US is also niftily transferring its own horrific crimes onto its target. It's a model how everything accused China of doing is straight out of its own history, from kids in concentration camps on the Mexican border to forced sterilizations of minorities by ICE, sexualized violence at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, millions of Muslims killed in its wars, Israel's 14-year blockade of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, and what we've seen them do to this year. Because the Chinese have been into a blank canvas, it's easy to make crudest yellow peril accusations stick. So the truth that was just destroying Britain's savage wars, the country that suffered invasion and massacre by some same nations that are currently circling like sharks a few miles off China's coast. It's risen to superpower status over the past few decades, all without war. And I think that's driving US nuts. China's raised over 800 million people of absolute poverty, created a middle class almost twice the size of the population of the US, built beautiful cities and infrastructure, and achieved COVID, barring occasional imported flares. So China just basically wants to make our stuff, stabilize the planet, and combat climate change as part of a multipolar world, which they've said that they want to do alongside America. But just as it draws near, the West decides to smash its needs. So, for example, the chair of Better Cotton Initiative claims there's forced labour in Xinjiang, despite state-of-the-art machinery bought from America as a John Deere company and fast rising wages. The fact that this chair is also president and CEO of American cotton marketing company Suma tells you everything about America's economic war on its rival. The declining power would rather take down its talented rival than work with it. It's like a supernova. America is both imploding and exploding at the same time, and it's in danger of leaving a fragmented shell of itself floating off space and taking us all with it. So without racism, it would be nigh impossible to lay these cartoon and stereotypes onto the Chinese people and make them stick. I'd hoped that we were far too and sophisticated to fall for those peril stereotypes. Older generations did in the 20th century, but here's CNN rolling out an alleged Chinese police defector in a fake uniform that doesn't even get the spelling right. So the media created a vacuum, excluding anything positive about China and filled it with a constant searching China bad until it's set like concrete. The danger, of course, also of repeating the big lie is that without balanced information, it eventually sticks. What really scares me about America, what's happened to the richest country on the planet, the post-war liberal order draws to a close. We see 10 cities proliferating, growing poverty, collapsing infrastructure, and literally power failures. The oligarchs who own politicians grabbed all the wealth until the top 0.1% owns as much as the bottom 90%. And now the same forces who ate all of this are diverting your anger onto China. People have been given permission to be raced in a cynical diversion of feared anger onto one identifiable group. So when you're upset over a picture of the latest victim of racism, remember that the end result of a deliberately orchestrated process of dehumanization. It required a lot of effort and resources to get the West to see Chinese as their punch bag. It required exclusion from political and cultural life, and even in social media. How many of the left are progressives follow or engage this on Twitter, and Asian women are at the bottom of the pile, and it's incredible how it's like we've been consigned to a ghetto. To express upset at racist violence while ignoring the conditions that got us here and consign us to a ghetto, collaborate in that process. Ultimately, if you don't care about the Chinese diaspora or see us as fellow Brits, you don't care about 1.4 billion human beings in China under attack from the alien superpower, at least spare a thought about what this war means for British people. Being clobbered by austerity and pauperized by a no-deal Brexit. If you think it's mere incompetence that's led to one of the highest COVID death rates in the world, think about how even before Biden became president, Boris Johnson voted Trump at every step since Pompeo made him a post-Brexit offer he couldn't refuse. The United States made China an offer it did refuse. It planted a horse's head in China's bed, and China is rightfully rejecting it. Thank you very much. Sorry about the technical glitches. I think you're all marvelous. I love you.
Thank you so much, Anna. So thank you very, very much, everyone, for being here. Amazing panelists, and maybe Anna will possibly re-record you, as Madison suggests, because the content was amazing, even if the audio wasn't perfect. We got so many different perspectives, and so we'll make sure this is all available and sent out to everyone. It was amazing to hear from the Chinese diaspora directly, and to hear so many different perspectives about the need for international solidarity, and to get a historical context as well. All the speakers, you've been amazing. You know, it's rare to have an event like this where everyone is at such a high caliber, and I'm not just saying that. So please keep in touch with the No Cold War Britain event, campaign, No Cold War International. Thank you. I think somebody has been putting everyone's links in the chat, so thank you for that. I mean, so many of you have had great presentations. Madison, you had a great deck, but we'll make sure that we share everyone's videos on social media. And really, this has been just really outstanding and inspiring. So thank you all.